bud. Well, good evening, and thank you so much, George, for that kind introduction. Let me begin by saying what a pleasure it is for me to be here with you this evening in this historic room in this beautiful city. And it's, of course, a delight to be here in support of all the important work that you all do for Drayton Hall. I'm honored, too, to have been included in this distinguished lecture series, and I'm very happy to see such a lively audience here tonight. This past week, we paused as a nation to mark the sesquicentennial of the end of the Civil War. 150 years and 2 days ago, an enormous crowd bobbed out to the rubble of Fort Sumter and listened to the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher deliver a speech at the ceremony in which the Stars and Stripes replaced the Stars and Bars that had stood sentinel over Charleston Harbor for 4 long years. Tonight I want to consider the post-war lives of those men who survived that most fearsome struggle. I first started thinking about the veterans of our nation's fratricidal war more than 15 years ago, when as a young Civil War buff, I got to know a man in my hometown of Akron, Ohio, who had passed his own childhood crisscrossing the Midwest in search of the last survivors of Lincoln's armies. Gary Dillon loved those men, and the stories that he told of wrinkled old soldiers puffing on fat cigars, swapping battle stories, made the Civil War real and immediate for me. They were men set apart, Gary told me on one occasion, recalling how they would often so vacantly stare into space. Even after so many decades, he said, one got the sense that they had never really put the war behind them. Gary, of course, knew the very last survivor of the Union Army, Albert Wilson, who died in Duluth, Minnesota at the age of 109 in August of 1956. And here he was, right? Nearly a century removed from the war, never having put it behind him. When I went off to graduate school, I suppose I was still thinking about that haunting remark. And I discovered, much to my surprise, that scholars, professional historians, scarcely knew Union veterans. On that rare occasion when Civil War veterans did appear in the history books, they were rendered as flat caricatures. Billy Yank, it was supposed, beat a hasty retreat from the killing fields, and then slipped into a welcoming civilian society with great ease. Union victory, after all, was something that we had always described as painless and unproblematic, something that was transparent, something that had immediate, tangible purpose and meaning. Union veterans, the conventional story went, slumbered as the nation retreated from the radical possibilities of Reconstruction. They made gluttonous demands on the federal treasury during the Gilded Age, and almost predictably, they embraced their former enemies in the twilight of their lives, promoting national healing at the expense of a real reckoning with the war, its cause, its charge, and its consequences. Billy Yank's old adversary, Johnny Reb, on the other hand, the conventional narrative goes, staggered home to a ruined and war-torn landscape, emasculated by defeat and besieged by physical, psychological, and pecuniary needs that penurious southern state governments were helpless to remedy. The South, after the Civil War, supposedly lay prostrate in defeat. In my talk tonight, I'm going to paint a very different picture, an almost counterintuitive picture of the road that led from Lee's surrender at Appomattox. First, I will argue that for the men of the Union Army, again, the war's demands persisted, mocking the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. For one, Union veterans tended to a staggering litany of battle injuries and emotional scars, wounds that provided ready-made metaphors for what they believed was the war's unfinished work. For another, they believed, and remarkably so, that military victory had neither settled the war's central issues nor resolved the ultimate fate of the Union. And finally, Union veterans were vexed by Northern civilians, white men and women who were eager to let bygones be bygones and ready to move quickly beyond the painful issues of the war. White Northern civilians deemed returning veterans the most unwelcome and unsettling reminders of a past they wanted only to forget. This would decidedly not be the case in the post-Civil War South. While Johnny Reb no doubt nursed frayed nerves and blasted hopes, he returned to a civilian society that had shared, quite literally, in the experience of defeat. It wasn't just the Army of Northern Virginia or the Army of Tennessee that was defeated in the Civil War. It was everyone who lived in South Carolina or Tennessee or Virginia that had decided to cast their lots with the Confederacy. The scars of Johnny Reb's war could neither be denied nor easily erased. Perhaps nowhere in all of the former Confederacy was this more apparent than here, in the cradle of secession. John Townsend Trowbridge, a New York-born journalist who made a now famous tour of the defeated South in the summer of 1865, noted that the ruins of this city were the most picturesque of all. Surveying the monotonous gloom of broken pillars, dilapidated porches, roofless homes, cracked slabs, shell-pocked walls, remnants of that 2-year-long federal bombardment, he pointedly observed that those haughty secessionist multitudes of 1861 had well been replaced by knots of half-asleep civilians in 1865. The only sign of a life seemed to be the turkey buzzard that circled mournfully overhead, he said. On his own tour of the defeated South and of the city of Charleston, Carl Schurz, a Republican member of the United States Senate, confirmed that few places had suffered so much from the ravage of war. Nearly 1 in 5 adult white males in South Carolina, by the time the war was over, would rest beneath a mute white headstone. None of this, of course, came as any immediate relief to returning Johnny Rebs. There were other reminders of Confederate defeat stalking the streets too, quite literally, most dramatically in the form of the African-American soldiers who shouldered the muskets of the federal military occupation, an occupation that in the summer of 1865 tightened its tenuous hold over both Charleston and the South, exacerbating racial tensions. But pause a second, one Confederate veteran protested. You can hear our master's shout of triumph ringing through the streets. Yet these things did ensure that Johnny Reb would return home to a community that understood his need to make sense of the past. And that was the crucial difference that I will develop for you tonight between Union and Confederate veterans. It was a community, the South, that shared, tragically, his longing for those ostensibly halcyon days when cotton was king. A community that would forge with and around him the lost cause mythology, that knot of ideas positing that the war had not been waged on behalf of slavery, but rather against an overweening federal government whose superior armies and resources made that fight unfair from the start. And so what I want to do tonight is to suggest the limits of the traditional categories that we've used to describe Civil War veterans. Neither victors nor victims, they were all survivors. Men who lived on, never really comfortable with putting away the past, and never really certain of the war's verdict. Ironically enough, Billy Yank won the war, but couldn't bear the peace, while Johnny Reb achieved a sort of victory in defeat. Ultimately, then, the experiences of Civil War veterans remind us that the stories we tell ourselves as a nation about war matter, and that public memory, far from being some academic abstraction, can have profound social consequences. The Civil War raged on for 4 bloody years. It was a conflict of unimaginable scope and scale. No one on either side could have predicted in 1861 the carnage of Antietam, the war's bloodiest day, the stench of Gettysburg, the war's bloodiest battle, or the obscenity of Andersonville, where 13,000 Union prisoners were quite literally starved to death in an open-air Georgia stockade. To speak only of the human cost, some 750,000 men would be killed. That's in excess of 2% of the population that was listed in the 1860 federal census. Another 1.5 million would count themselves among the wounded by the time it was all said and done. At least 25,000 returned north, missing an arm or a leg. Never before in all of American history would so many men at a single time be called veterans. For these mangled and maimed survivors of the war, pain proved the first obstacle to forgetfulness. Each throb, each twinge, each sting prolonged and magnified reminiscences of the war. Our feelings will last a lifetime, one veteran acknowledged. This was, to borrow from the historian Drew Gilpin Faust's formulation, a living republic of suffering. 24-year-old Daniel Eldridge was a New Hampshire veteran who returned home with several fragments of rebel lead painfully wedged between the tendons of his left arm, a souvenir of the Battle of Deep Bottom in Virginia in 1864. But old Dan Eldridge was activated, not silenced by his injury. Each day he toiled on a memoir of his service, every new word sending currents of pain traveling up that fractured limb. He set out to write a short narrative, but by 1867, the memoir that he thought would consume no more than a dozen pages numbered more than 600 and was illustrated with dozens of hand-inked campaign and battle maps. His injury demanded context and meaning, and the young soldier would literally write through his pain in a search for both. Even those who returned without physical injuries found the war, of course, difficult to escape. The momentous events of less than 10 years ago are too fresh in memory to be forgotten at the command of any party that might be benefited by ignoring them, one veteran snarled. Conceding that the Civil War was the most intense experience of their lives, indeed, think of the contradictory emotions that were packed into that surreal space of 3 or 4 years. Men who spent years yearning for home now well felt oddly apprehensive about the prospect of peace. Longing for the now oddly comforting sounds of battle, some veterans placed surplus percussion caps and spare friction primers on active railroad tracks and waited anxiously for the explosion. They even staged sham battles on town greens in an effort to relive the drama. In 1871, a Wisconsin man, known to mutter incomprehensibly about his military service and a certain Captain Chase, pounded a line of sticks into the ground behind his barn, and by moonlight, every evening in perfect military parlance, would command his white bulldog to charge at the imaginary rebel picket line until he was packed off to the Wisconsin Hospital for the Insane. Others had little need for these reenactments. The war still rang in their ears and flashed before their eyes. Henry Hartwell, an artillerist from Michigan, claimed in June of 1865 that he'd never really left Chickamauga, where the rebels had seized one of his guns in a fierce Georgia battle. Even yet, the veteran claimed, he could see the rebel hosts as they wrested the rammers from the gunners' hands. He could distinctly hear the volcanic discharges as they dealt death upon the advancing foe. These men quickly apprehended that their broken bodies and haunted minds were metaphors for the war's uncertain verdict. One-armed and one-legged men were hardly emasculated by their injuries. They instead became some of the most vocal and articulate among Union veterans. A stunning number of amputees, appreciating the testimonial power of their hacked and hewed frames, refused to wear government-issued prosthetic appliances. Many sat for photographs that they would then distribute throughout the North, prominently displaying their exposed stumps. Newspapers, North and South, began carping about the one-legged soldier, waving his crutch all over the North with the news that the war is not yet over. The maimed and the crippled ones, a one-armed Iowa ex-soldier explained, speak with living tongues of the crimes of the Copperheads and the open rebels. And so while Union veterans never failed to declare their pride in having fought for what they believed to be a just and righteous cause, they nonetheless insisted, self-effacingly, that their victory was incomplete. We might well have hoped that when the last rebel surrendered, when our arms were victorious everywhere, one veteran grieved in October of 1866, that peace and concord and unity should prevail. But of course it did not. The South offered little reassurance that it would acquiesce to any brokered peace. The unprecedented assassination of a president, cruel race riots in Memphis and New Orleans, the rebels who exchanged gray uniforms for white hoods, and the return of the antebellum white leadership to social and political power all across the South combined to leave Billy Yank wondering if indeed he'd won this war after all. In Charleston, for instance, that first summer after the war, there were 138 reported assaults on freedmen by former masters. Billy Yank's keen sense of what he had fought for might have steeled him for the storm of battle, but now, ironically enough, it left him rattled in the throes of peace. He looked on as his former enemies, reassured by their escape from reprisal, defiantly belted the South with repressive black codes. We see every day the old hostility cropping out in continued acts of antagonism to the Reconstruction laws of Congress, one veteran insisted. The animus of treason and rebellion is as vindictive and deadly now as it was in 1861 and during the late war. Minnesotan Miles Hollister was likewise unsatisfied with the war's results. "Let me see my country placed in the hands of her defenders," he began. "Let me see peace and quiet and harmony and brotherly love and friendship and law and order prevail all throughout the land, in all sections," he declared. "And then when these results shall have been fully accomplished, and the nation is in full enjoyment of the fruits thereof, only then will the great reveille be sounded for me." In short, Union veterans refused to go quietly in the face of the pardons and the lynchings and the rumors of another rebellion that promised to make the first look like a fairly bloodless skirmish. "It becomes our duty now," one Pennsylvania veteran declared, "to set ourselves at work and to reap the fruits of our victory." For many ex-soldiers, reaping the fruits of victory meant meting out punishment for treason, even if that meant compromising the classical small R Republican citizen soldier's obligation to return home and quickly perfume the whiff of anything martial. What will all the blood and treasure expended by the loyal people of this republic amount to if men and measures of the late rebellion are again permitted to rule? One ex-soldier demanded. "I'm not in good humor with the rebels yet," a second lieutenant from Ohio confessed, wishing only for one more opportunity, as he said, to finish them off. "They've caused too much loss of life and too much suffering," he said, "to be easily forgotten." One survivor of Andersonville, the Confederacy's most notorious prison hell, volunteered to assist with the construction of a wooden scaffold for ex-rebel President Jefferson Davis. "I would like to be the one to lend a helping hand," he wrote that first summer after the war. "Through the divine providence of God, I am spared to witness the close of this wicked and unjust rebellion." He was a carpenter before the war and even included in this petition to the new President Andrew Johnson blueprints for what that gibbet constructed on the east front of the Capitol might look like. Around the country, veterans organizations passed resolutions demanding the execution of Jeff Davis, of Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, of Robert E. Lee, of other high-ranking rebel authorities. Other Union veterans resolved that their work would not be complete until African Americans had secured their civil and political rights. Dozens of ex-soldiers volunteered not to return home, but rather to continue to remain in the South, to garrison southern cities in the armies of occupation. These armies of occupation, which, much to the chagrin of white Southerners like John Drayton, defended former slaves and in some cases encouraged them to resist iniquitous labor contracts. Other Union veterans, so inclined, assumed leadership roles in the Freedmen's Bureau, which of course managed the transition between slavery and freedom and took charge of the South's first free public schools. One such veteran was the Massachusetts-born Moulton Emery, who in January of 1866 inked a lease on Drayton Hall when John Drayton resigned to pack himself off to East Texas rather than to endure the humiliation of occupation here. The claim should be made with extraordinary caution, but Billy Yank assumed a position far in advance of his pre-war self and post-war civilian society on the questions of race. There were many great questions which we had not thought much upon before the war. One veteran explained candidly on Memorial Day 1868, reproaching Andrew Johnson for his vile brand of Reconstruction. My comrades, we today at the graves of our fallen brethren hurl a rebuke to narrow-mindedness and unfairness and declare that we believe in the largest liberty for all men, irrespective of nation or color. No reconciliation, two comrades concluded, can endure which is not founded in justice, and especially is no reconciliation sure to abide that is not devoted to the highest and best interests of this country as a country of freedom. Union veterans were not unilaterally opposed to reuniting with the South then, but they did demand a measured reconciliation, one that was mindful of all that the war had cost them personally and what it had ostensibly achieved politically. This was anathema to most white Northerners, which leads me to yet another point, that Union veterans return home only to fight another war, a war with white Northern civilians. While Union victory was no doubt loudly cheered in the spring and summer of 1865, the hymns of that ovation hardly drowned out the bitter social and political dramas that had rent the wartime Northern home front. Union veterans, after all, returned to a civilian population that had rioted, resisted, and reached no consensus, either about the meaning of the war or their participation in it. By exalting the end of hostilities, by declaring the Union saved and the slaves freed, Northerners dismissed the extent to which the war had left this unfinished business. With a rhetorical alchemy that transmuted stump-sweeping pus into unambiguously honorable scars, civilians foreclosed most any chance for Union veterans to share their horrific war stories. Civilians could hardly countenance their ugly tales. Even the few editors who published their words in popular magazines opted to delete so-called harsh adjectives and fearsome realism. None of this was lost, of course, on the war's ex-soldiers. As modern war psychiatrists like Robert J. Lifton and Jonathan Shea have pointed out, sharing stories about war and finding an audience for them, a receptive, respectful audience for them, is a crucial part of any veteran's return to normalcy, if indeed he can return to a sense of normalcy at all. Billy Yank would impatiently wait while white Northerners swiftly embraced the spirit of sectional reconciliation. White civilians were wearied of war work, unable to comprehend the tempest of battle, lacked any activating sympathy for the plight of the former slave. Already one cantankerous Michigan soldier grumbled the day before Lee's surrender. The Reverend Henry Ward Beecher and commenced to preach forgiveness and forgetfulness of the past. Ready to let bygones be bygones, civilians largely ignored the social problems that attended demobilization. Northerners, as Jason Sokol has pointed out in a recent book on race in the 20th century, have consistently advanced a selective interpretation of their region, one that cleverly circumvents interpretive snarls and celebrates the North as a region of unimpeachable virtue. Well, true to form, Northern wartime voluntary aid societies like the United States Sanitary Commission and the Christian Commission both shuttered their headquarters by October of 1865 and instead got to work debating how they would best commemorate their own heroism. State legislatures from Ohio to New York rejected legislation that would have provided temporary homes for dislocated soldiers. Plans for a federal soldiers' home met with maddening delays. It took more than a year to seat the quorum of the congressionally appointed Board of Managers for the National Home for the Disabled Volunteer Soldier, which, when it was finally up and running, serviced 2,000 veterans of a population of Union veterans that numbered nearly 2 million. Moreover, in an age ruled by the so-called law of local sympathy and laissez-faire individualism, the problems of readjustment were attributed not to the war, but rather to individual character flaws. Thinking Billy Yank morally depraved by the experience of combat and killing, employers refused to hire him. Unemployment rates among veterans soared as veterans would take to begging in the streets, to hand organ grinding, alcohol, and in some cases the opium they had first sampled in the Civil War field hospital. Scarcely 2 months after the Welcome Home celebration that greeted Billy Yank in Lower Manhattan, a parade of more than 300 unemployed Union veterans advanced down Broadway, the first major veterans parade after the war. These self-styled former employees of Grant and Sheridan hoisted banners into the air demanding work and wages. But as one veteran dolefully concluded, the good people of this country were tired of giving and disgusted at the sight of the crippled relic of the war. In London, Connecticut, Mayor Frederick Lee Allen deemed an intolerable nuisance the two veterans who made a living begging for spare change on the village green and ordered them to leave town at once. Veterans documented hundreds of similar cases all across the North in the pages of their periodicals. This treatment prompted veterans to lapse into expressions of outright hatred for those who had stayed at home, or in some cases, those who had purchased a substitute or dodged the draft. Betrayal oozed from these veterans' pens in the immediate post-war period. A nation, a state, a county, a town, a city, a people that will allow its maimed and crippled soldiers to be sent to a poorhouse, or that will compel them to beg from house to house about the streets for the necessaries of life, one Illinois regimental surgeon concluded, is not fit to enjoy the blessings of a free and enlightened government. What do they know of the sufferings of our poor comrades who were starved to death in Andersonville, Belle Isle, Danville, Libby, other rebel dens? What do they know of the horrors of the battlefields of Antietam, of Gettysburg, the Wilderness, Cedar Creek, Winchester, Chickamauga, and hundreds of others? Ironically enough, it was the civilians' insistent plea to put away the scenes of the war that only lent additional weight to Billy Yank's intuition that he could not. Our people are too ready to forget the cause of the boys in blue, one veteran bewailed, predicting accurately that unwise deference to the feelings of the pardoned rebels would prompt future generations to reflect upon the war merely as a duel where the opposing parties met to fight and then shake hands. Union veterans demanded a solemn remembrance of the past. So deep a wound as this country has just received, one veteran explained, cannot be healed in a day. In the face of civilians' willed forgetfulness then, some veterans took desperate action. Northern newspapers reported almost daily the details of successful and unsuccessful suicide attempts among Union veterans. One Massachusetts soldier consumed a lethal dose of rat poison, while another donned his blue uniform one last time, and splayed himself across the tracks of the Poughkeepsie River Railroad to wait for an oncoming locomotive to end his misery. A slender, tobacco-spitting misanthrope, known only to history as Charlie the Boatman, slit his throat one evening in the Milwaukee Soldiers' Home, surrounded by the wads of tinfoil that he had passed countless hours shaping into cannonballs. Cannonballs, he said, like the one that hurtled toward me at Shiloh. Other veterans necessarily turned inward to one another. They organized for their own relief, made routine calls on the sick, and appealed to one another for financial aid. Indeed, the Grand Army of the Republic, the largest of the Northern Veterans Orders, ought to rank in our narratives not as some crass adjunct to the Republican Party, but rather as one of the most engaged and successful social welfare organizations of the late 19th century. And it would have no civilian help. Stridently lobbying state legislatures and the federal government for soldiers' homes, for government jobs, for hiring preferences and pension benefits, veterans articulated a novel ideology and a strikingly modern ideology of veterans' rights. Does the Republic owe the soldier nothing for daring death that it might live? One veterans newspaper asked in September of 1870. If it be a weakness in us to cherish our old memories, yet deal tenderly with us, suffer us while we do live. Still, civilians continued in the North to deride veterans as nuisances with an unhealthy addiction to the past. The Grand Army in particular was singled out as an organization with sinister and decidedly un-Republican motives. They proposed to keep alive the wrath and the bitterness of that dreadful time, one Northern editor insisted on the front page of the New York Times. We say, let all the fearful memories of the past sink into the hell to which they belong. Let us think only of wounds to be healed, of harvests to grow again, of seas once more covered in the ships of our commerce, of education for the ignorant, protection to the oppressed, justice for all. Confederate veterans, on the other hand, would encounter few of these difficulties. For victory invited men and women to look ahead. Defeat, of its own bleak necessity, obliged all to look back. The men and women of the Confederacy, like their historians after them, would debate endlessly who was responsible for rebel defeat and how best to assuage its traumas. Dear Charlotte, one Savannah woman sighed in a characteristic utterance. How can we ever give up the Confederacy? With few exceptions, the vanquished rebels sacralized the war in a way that venerated the dead and the living as monuments to a lost cause that they remained absolutely certain would one day be vindicated. Ladies' memorial associations, like the one headquartered here in Charleston, got to work almost immediately after the war, decorating graves, raising money for monuments, and attending veterans' reunions as dutiful sponsors. One common Confederate reunion ritual entailed the highly symbolic presentation of young virgins to the grizzled old soldiers. Southern women likewise presided over Memorial Day rites, which well into the 20th century remained an important site of Confederate memory and a cornerstone of a Southern civil religion. Tellingly, as early as 1875, Northerners were flirting with proposals to cease such observances, suggesting that they tended too much to keep up the bitter memories of the war. A population engaged in working out the war's great issues thus made a difference for Confederate veterans, who no doubt tended to the same ghastly wounds, haunted minds, and hemorrhaging bowels as Billy Yank. But despite all of this suffering, one will comb in vain the nearly 2,000 questionnaires distributed in the early 20th century by the archivist of the state of Tennessee to rebel veterans for a single suggestion of civilian betrayal. Ex-rebels carped not about their reception at home or the way that their services were recognized and acknowledged, but rather about the fatiguing on-foot journey that led them there. So too did the reality that Confederates were, as a cohort, far more conspicuous than their former enemies, make a difference. Fully 3/4 of the South's white military-age population had been mobilized over the course of 1861-65. Virtually every 19, 20, and 21-year-old in the South immediately after the war was a Confederate veteran. And in lieu of the stone sentinels that few municipalities could afford to erect on town greens, were distinguished as, again, the living monuments of a fight that all knew was unequal. Johnny Reb did, of course, lack access to the federal pension bureaucracy, which by the final decade of the 19th century was supplying finally honorably discharged Union veterans with monthly checks. Still, this proved in the long run perhaps less of a setback than most historians have imagined. Because in the absence of formal state or government aid for Confederate veterans, a moral economy of civilian gratitude, one that was often religious and local, even on the neighborhood level in nature, would flourish. By the spring of 1866, for example, the ladies of Charleston had opened a subscription-funded soldiers' home that was caring for more than 70 needy ex-rebels. That same year, 2 private citizens here in Charleston once again appealed on behalf of one-armed and one-legged ex-Confederates to the South Carolina General Assembly, which quickly, by the way, approved legislation appropriating $20,000 to underwrite the cost of wooden arms, legs, and feet. Within a month, Confederate amputees were arriving in Charleston to be fitted for prosthetic appliances at the office of Dr. Douglas Bly. Equally important here is the fact that Johnny Reb could accept such assistance without imperiling his own triumphal narrative of character, virility, and independence. He would be sure to remind that Billy Yank and even the doughboys of the First World War after them had in their notorious demands for benefits surrendered all 3. We went to work in a ruined country and built up our own fortunes and character with our people, one ex-rebel observed in the pages of Confederate Veteran magazine. We depended upon our own efforts to overcome adverse conditions. With this variety of immodest rhetoric, Confederate veterans fanned, then, the war's smoldering embers. They formed a host of veterans organizations, rifle clubs, dutifully collected regimental records, preserved muster rolls, published histories, and delivered speeches that damned the supposed tyranny of Reconstruction, while vindicating their cause as eternally right and just. The world must truthfully be told what we did and what we suffered, Brigadier General John Preston told the men of the South Carolina Survivors Association in 1870. It is a tale of woe, but it is wonderfully glorious. Like their counterparts in blue, then, Confederate veterans are a telling reminder that the Civil War only fitfully faded into the peace. The events of the late war between the Confederate and Union states, one South Carolina veteran agitatedly confessed, remain fresh in my memory. Historians, then, have not yet done enough to consider how this war continued to exact its punishing demands after Appomattox and beyond. The seeming finality of surrender, together with the perfectly dressed ranks of the victory parade, has concealed the gnawing uncertainty that animated those immediate post-war years. We might indeed rethink that single beam of light that, extending from Fort Sumter, cuts across the sky above Charleston Harbor this evening, symbolizing the return of peace and the advent of sectional reunion. For Union victory was hardly a transparent statement of fact. It demanded much, but settled less. Nor was Confederate defeat any meaningful augur of the path that would lead to the new century over lynched African-American bodies and into the period of Jim Crow. The war did not have a single chronology with a fixed beginning and a fixed end. It was, as Walt Whitman described it, a many-threaded drama, with riddles that long after the stacking of muskets continued to taunt and vex. The veterans on both sides, who spent the rest of their lives leaning into crutches, begging for spare change, guzzling bottles of rum, make that painfully evident. Appomattox was hardly an end. In many ways, it was only the beginning. If old soldiers never die, and the wars they fight linger. As a nation, once again, occupying that strange and liminal space we call the post-war, I think we would do well to ponder that lesson. Thank you so very much. All right, I believe we have some time for questions. Yes?
There are areas of this country that were border areas where men from the same communities fought on different sides.
Yeah.
Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, Kansas. When they came home, albeit with red tape, the Union veterans got some pension benefits. Talk a little bit about what happened to those veterans who come home living side by side.
Mm-hmm. The question is asked about the numerous areas across Civil War America that were border areas, areas that had fielded both Union and Confederate soldiers. And interestingly enough, every Confederate state will have one of these areas. Even Mississippi will raise a Union regiment. Alabama will raise a Union regiment. So every state in Civil War America will be in some place a border area. But it is, and you do see in those instances, especially in the western hills of North Carolina, especially in Kentucky, you see quite literally neighborhood wars break out. And certainly that's true out on the frontier and out on the Missouri-Kansas frontier too. You see Grand Army posts that are quite literally become targets of the rifle clubs and the clans in places in the Deep South. So it literally becomes a kind of a neighborhood struggle. And we need much more work, and there is some excellent work underway by some current PhD students that are working on that very problem of what does it mean to be a Union veteran. Of course, the other thing you have to consider here too is that it's difficult to be a Union veteran when you're in that army of occupation. And especially difficult when the predominant, person that's making up that army of occupation is an African American soldier. They're disproportionate in those armies of occupation. So it's a terrible place for them to be in. And you really don't, for Confederate veterans, they're not going north. Many of them will go out to Texas. They'll go out farther west. Some will pack up and make their way out to Brazil and in other places, even in South America. One of Jimmy Carter's Confederate ancestors is buried in Brazil, where he was the leader of one of these expatriate Confederate colonies. But you don't, again, I think it's so important to recognize that although there is this, although they have been defeated, right? Culturally, they haven't been defeated, and so that's very important. It's much more difficult, I think, to live in one of these border areas as a Union veteran. Yes.
It appears that the Union soldiers suffered from what we call today post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
More than the Confederate soldiers. Why do you think? It almost seems like today we haven't advanced all that much in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. Why do you think that's the case?
The question is about post-traumatic stress and why we really haven't advanced much in kind of the treatment of that. I certainly I resist making the claim in the book that that veterans were suffering from post-traumatic stress. I don't want to diagnose across the decades. My doctorate's in history and not psychology. But we can see those behaviors, right? And we know that that's, were they around today, that's the language that we would use. Language is a big barrier and a big problem for them. They simply have no lexicon with which to describe this problem in the 19th century. And, of course, truth. Truth is always, tethered to this idea of memory. Right? And establishing the truth of that story is so important for these men, and it's what they crave. They want, they don't want a monument on the town green to their service. They don't want a shelf of books in the library. They want recognition and acknowledgement that, yes, you wrote a blank check with your life to save the Union and to end slavery, and now we have to deal with the consequences. And they come home and they try to explain that. And they also try to explain, I'm still feeling the sensations of Andersonville. I'm still hearing the rebel dogs that chased me at Andersonville. I'm still hearing those. All of the different behaviors that we have in post-traumatic stress. They're explaining that, but there's no lexicon with which to describe it, which becomes a problem for them. But I think we still have this skepticism, right, which I think is the problem. I think we like to think about ourselves having, Civil War America is a place that's ideologically and infrastructurally ill-equipped to deal with the problem of returning veterans. There's no VA, there's no diagnostic language. And ideologically, this is still a classical Republican society that expects citizen soldiers to emerge from farm communities, go off, fight your heroic battles, come back, pick up the plow, and demand no reward. And I think, infrastructurally, we've started to deal with some of those issues, although the recent stuff in the news about the VA suggests that, we haven't even got the infrastructure right yet. But I think ideologically, we're still there, right? And we still have no... and people often, people ask me at these things, and they've read the book, and they say, well, what do you suggest that we do? And I think it's not an easy answer, but I think we need a national ritual of reintegration, a national way to have some kind of conversation about what war means and what our narratives do to it. That will see to them, a bit of authority for them to be the subjects of their own stories instead of treating them as either victims or victors. That's our default position, right? They're a victor or they're a victim. And they need to be the subjects of their own stories. So I think it's an ideological problem that we have, that we just have no good way to deal with that. And there's still a lingering skepticism. Some of the things that I've read in Union soldiers' pension files about doctors who come out and say, you're making this, this affliction that you have that you claim is from that winter that you spent outside of Fredericksburg, you're making this up. Prove it. You went to Andersonville, you don't have problems sleeping at night. Even the most dramatic example of someone grabbing the stump and, claiming that, it was a farming accident, right? Again, we need a national ritual of reintegration. We need a national way to have that conversation. And the problem is that veterans are always prisms for the way that we view the politics of a war. And the messier the war is, and the less certain the aims and the motives going in, the worse the reception is going to be. And we like to think about the Civil War as being something that we had definitive reason, it was a war to save the Union and free the slaves. It wasn't. Abraham Lincoln lost 45% of the popular vote in the 1864 presidential election for a reason, because there was no consensus about it. World War II veterans, of all of our American veterans, probably fared the best. I think it's because that war, again, the most unambiguous of all of our conflicts. Yeah?
What can you tell us about the troops marching home, both sides, learning of Lincoln's assassination?
Yeah.
So it's early in the game.
Absolutely. The question is about learning the news of Lincoln's assassination for troops on both sides. It's absolutely devastating for Union veterans who really felt that, they may have had differences with Lincoln as commander-in-chief, but they understood that Lincoln had grown with them in this war. They had, begun this war as kind of cumbersome green volunteer armies, and they had become a true fearsome fighting force. And Lincoln had made that progression too. He had come in, without any experience, actually having built a political career, being a war opponent, and of course emerges as the most successful commander-in-chief, arguably in all of American history. There was a connection there. And you read their accounts of the Grand Review, which again, May 23rd and May 24th, 1865, this brilliant victory parade that extends all the way down Pennsylvania Avenue from Capitol Hill to the White House. 200,000 soldiers from the eastern and western theaters participate. Sherman's men are there, the Army of the Potomac's there. And we portrayed in our history books, right, as this moment where everyone was celebrating. And these men write about it being a funereal march for two reasons. It's consistent in almost every diary account you find of the Grand Review. One is that to get there, especially for Sherman's men who are marching up from South Carolina all the way to Washington, I mean, that's the hardest marching they've done the entire war, is to get up to Washington for this parade. They're marching over bone-strewn battlefields in North Carolina and Virginia. They're seeing the remnants of the war, of comrades. And then they get there, and of course, Lincoln is not there, and they're going to march beyond a reviewing stand that does not have their beloved commander-in-chief, and they're marching only 5 blocks from where Booth's bullet has changed the course of Reconstruction. And they lament the absence of, they said they felt palpably the Father Abraham was with them, but his absence made it like a funereal march. And it was something they never really got over. And it's also interesting to think about, one of the great historiographic questions that we, of course, can answer. It's what would have happened to Reconstruction if Lincoln had lived? It's interesting to think about that last paragraph of the second inaugural, right, where Lincoln implores the Republic to care for him who had borne the battle. Interesting to think about what might have happened there. Confederate veterans, they were of two minds about it. Some were openly, brazenly cheering that Booth's attempt, of course, not only to kill Lincoln, but to decapitate the government, to kill Seward, to take out perhaps Grant. Some of them were just brazen in their applauding Booth's last act, as it were. But others, and I think very wisely and presciently, worried that, okay, we've now just kind of come out of this immediate post-war period. Now that this has happened, is there going to be reprisal? Is this going to create a remilitarization of the South? And are we now going to have to worry about our lives? Yes, whatever Grant says at Appomattox about magnanimous terms, is that all going to be reversed now that Lincoln is dead? And so some of them are too afraid to say anything because they don't want to go up on treason charges. They don't want reprisal. So they're of divided minds about it. And later on, interestingly enough, many of them will reflect that that assassination, of course, D.W. Griffith, and perhaps the most important popular manifestation of the memory of Reconstruction, the film Birth of a Nation, right? As openly racist and as Birth of a Nation is, the central premise of that film is that the greatest tragedy that befell the South was Lincoln's death, because instead what they got were the vindictive radical Republicans that Lincoln could have kept in check were he alive. So over time, they came to join in the wails of mourning for Lincoln. Yeah?
Let's take one more question.
How was the black veterans received both in the North and the South?
Yeah. Question is about the reception of black veterans. And black veterans actually are an interesting counterpoint to the white Union veterans in the North. Because they return home, of course, to a civilian population that understands exactly what this war is about. The 250,000 free African Americans who are living in the North understand that this is a war of jubilee. This is a war for freedom. This is a quest to kill slavery. And in the black communities in the North, those veterans become heroes. They rise immediately to powerful positions in the black community. They become ministers. They have great success. The other part of this story that's really interesting that I think is too often left out of our history books, and this again plays on some of the changes in the racial attitudes of mainstream Union veterans. The Grand Army of the Republic, the largest Northern Veterans Order, it's the only non-segregated fraternal brotherhood in late 19th century America. Black and white veterans had shared a sense of comradeship. And of course, black veterans, 10% of the Union armies, 188,000 black men fought for the Union Army. 10% of the Army, despite being only 2% of the population. And white Billy Yanks would never forget that. And they welcomed him into the ranks of the GAR. There were other, difficulties particular to African American veterans, especially when it came time for pension time, because of course the pension affidavits often required a birthplace or a specific history, a pre-war history that, as many of them being former slaves, they could not provide a birth date, they could not provide a birthplace, they could not provide many of the things that white veterans could readily supply. So there were difficulties that way. But I think generally the experience for African American Union veterans within their home communities is a stark contrast to the experience of white veterans. All right, thank you so very much.